Hello and welcome back to another book review. As promised, I'm reviewing The Prospect of Immortality today by Robert Ettinger. This is a very old book now. It was written in 1962, I believe. And this book is all about cryonics. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what cryonics is, I'll just give you a brief outline. The basic premise is that with cryonics, after you die, your body gets frozen in a tank and stored in a facility. And it's done because, in theory, as time goes on, medical technology advances and progresses, and in 100 years time or 500 years time from now, if a body has been preserved well enough, medical science might be able to bring that person back to life. And so that's cryonics. It's about freezing bodies. Now, it's not as crude as you might think. The whole process has been quite refined and finely tuned. So if you freeze a body, you would get ice, and that's very bad. That would completely wreck the body's cells. So now you can actually get a kind of medical antifreeze, and when somebody is declared dead in a hospital, they actually pump all of the fluid and the water and the blood out of the body, and they replace it with this antifreeze. And so when the body's frozen, there's no ice and there's kind of minimal damage. So that's the basic premise of cryonics, and this book is like the original book of cryonics. Robert Ettinger is considered to be the founding father of the whole cryonics movement, and he wrote this book in 1962, and it's probably the most famous book there is about cryonics. And I've been reading it over the last 2 weeks or so. I've finished it now, and it is an amazing book. There's lots of interesting things in here. So the book starts off by pointing out that cryonics isn't that controversial after all. The book claims that Benjamin Franklin was actually interested in similar things himself. Benjamin Franklin was quoted as saying that he was interested in resuscitating people after their heart stopped beating. And back then, in that era, that was kind of similar to the idea of cryonics. So the book starts out by quoting Benjamin Franklin, and then it also goes on to say that the whole book is based on an established fact and a reasonable assumption. Now, the established fact is that right now we can preserve people and store their bodies without causing any significant damage. That's the fact. And the reasonable assumption is, if civilization continues and progresses, in the future we might be able to bring them back. That's the basic premise of the book and of cryonics itself. And it starts off by making another important point. Most people think that death is an event, a single event, but it's actually not. You should see death as more of a process than an event. A good way to kind of make you realise this is that there are two types of death. There are actually more than that, but I'll just stick to two for simplicity. There's clinical death, and then there's biological death. Clinical death is where your heart stops beating and your lungs stop breathing. Now, if that happened 100 years ago, doctors would have said that person is dead. They're finished, so we can't do anything. But now, if somebody's heart stops beating or their lungs stop working, we can bring them back to life by giving them the kiss of life, or whatever it's called, or we put them on a machine that gets their lungs working again, and we can get their heart beating again. So clinical death no longer means death. It just means your organs have stopped. Now, biological death means it's kind of one step further. It means right now we can't bring that person back to life, but it only means right now. So in the future, it's possible that that person can be resuscitated. So there's an important distinction between different types of death. The book then goes on to speak about the technical subjects, or the technicalities of cryonics. Ettinger speaks about, in the future you might have fault-controlled mechanical limbs. Now this is especially interesting because it's actually become a reality. I know that there's at least one person in the world who has got a mechanical hand that is fault-controlled. You can look this up yourself. So in 1962, Robert Ettinger predicted this, and it's actually become a reality. He also speaks about artificial organs that might happen in the future. Again, this is now a reality. You can actually get 3D printed organs using a 3D printer. Again, look it up if you don't believe me. So there are two predictions there that have come true. He talks about that, how in the future we might be able to grow new limbs, just like certain animals can do, by kind of extracting their genes and putting the animal genes in us. I think there are some certain lizards that can regrow limbs, so that might become a real thing. He says that it would be a very good idea to freeze some of your cells for later use. This has also become a reality. You can now kind of extract some of your cells and put them in freezer storage, because when you're older, your cells don't kind of work as well, and if you need an organ transplant, or if you need blood, it's always better to use your own cells and your own DNA. So if you're young, you can freeze your DNA. He also goes one step further and says there might be a time when you could actually, well, you can do it now, but it's a good idea to freeze some of your brain cells in order to preserve your memories. He anticipates a time when if your memories are stored in some way, scientists of the future might be able to recreate your mind and your brain and your personality. So that's another point he makes. And it's important to note that I think this book was written pre-organ transplant era. Right now, in modern times, it's very common to get an organ transplant, like a kidney transplant or even a heart transplant. In 1962, when this book was written, I don't think it was that common. I don't think people were having organ transplants. So this book was way ahead of its time in many respects. The book then goes on to speak about the religious aspects of cryonics. Of course, there are going to be some religious people who have problems with it. But he's quite optimistic that religious people will kind of come around to the idea of cryonics. So religious people like to point out, or like to believe, that human beings have a soul. Religious people think that we're more than just material tissue. Religious people like to think that there's an idea of a soul. And so some religious people might think, hold on, if you freeze somebody and then bring them back to life, what have you done with their soul? That's not right. You've kind of interfered with their soul. But he points out the fact that if somebody's heart stops beating and their lungs stop working, like clinical death, they've got no problem with people bringing those people back to life by starting their heart and lungs again. So if you do that, that's no different than freezing somebody and then bringing them back to life. Also, he points out the fact that religious people, if somebody's on a life support machine in hospital and that machine is keeping them alive, quite often it's the religious people that say you have to keep that person on the machine and keep them alive. They're the ones who say that you shouldn't let them die. And so cryonics is just an extension of that. You're putting somebody in another medical piece of technology, and then you're keeping them alive. So it's just an extension of a life support machine. A cryonics tank or a cryostat, it's just a big life support machine. And religious people haven't got a big problem with life support machines now, so why should they have a problem with a cryostat? It's a very interesting point that he makes there. He then goes on to speak about the legal aspects of cryonics, and this is where things can get quite funny and interesting. He points out that if you're only clinically dead, if you're frozen, you're not technically dead. You could come back to life, so you're clinically dead. And if you're clinically dead, you should still have certain legal rights. You should be able to own assets. You should be able to own property. You should be able to own trust funds. And he even speaks about frozen people paying taxes still, even though they're frozen, which is quite funny. He anticipates that insurance payouts will become very complicated because insurance companies pay out if people die. But if somebody's frozen, the insurance company might say, hold on, that person's not dead, so I'm not paying out the money. Very interesting point. He points out that if or when cryonics becomes mainstream and it becomes kind of like run-of-the-mill procedure, if you fail to freeze somebody, it could constitute murder, or at the very least manslaughter. That's an interesting point. You could get arrested for not freezing somebody. Now he talks about marriage here. Now this is hilarious. There could be a time when a married woman or a married man has a wife or a husband who dies. That spouse then gets frozen, and so that person is left a widow or a widower. Now, quite reasonably, that person might go on to marry again, and then they might die, and their new partner might die, and they might both get frozen. So there might be a time in the future where people get resuscitated and brought back to life, and they find that they've got more than one wife or more than one husband. What's going to happen? Who knows? How would you sort that one out? It's hilarious, but it might happen, and it's a real problem. What would happen? He actually points out that if you get resuscitated in the future, you might be modified to such an extent that you might look at your old wife or husband and think, I don't even like them anymore. They might not appeal to you in the same way. So it might be a problem, or it might not. It's an interesting point. He also points out that if somebody's frozen in the future, you might actually vote on their behalf, because politics will affect that person. Even though they're frozen, they're going to wake up in the future and they're going to be part of society again. So it might be a good thing to kind of vote for them. That's another interesting thing. Economics is mentioned in the book, the economics of cryonics. He speaks about how intelligent, self-replicating robots with unlimited productivity might become a real thing in the future. This will help us because we won't have to work as much, and that will kind of speed up the whole process of technology even more. He speaks about overpopulation, which is often mentioned with cryonics. People worry about overpopulation if people keep getting frozen. But he says it's not a problem, because we can colonize other planets. We could possibly live underground to create more space. And finally, this is brilliant, he says we might even take turns being frozen. If the world becomes overpopulated, 50% of the population could say, okay, we'll get frozen for a few years and let you live on the planet, and then we'll come out of stasis, and then it'll be your turn to get frozen. He thinks that might happen. He also mentions that communists might initially be against a mainstream freezer program, because communism generally is about the state rather than the individual, and cryonics is more about the individual, so there might be some animosity there to start off with. But again, Ettinger is quite optimistic that given enough time, even communists will end up being pro-cryonics, because it's a big benefit to everyone, really. And he then goes on to talk about the problem of identity and self, because in theory, if you bring somebody back to life after they've been frozen and you modify them, that you modify their body or their brain, you could say that that won't be the same person. It'll be a kind of different person that comes back. So he talks at length about some kind of thought experiments regarding the self and what is a person's identity and stuff like that. He speaks about 12 experiments, but there are 2 or 3 that I found especially interesting. He talks about an experiment where everybody's made of atoms. So if you took apart a human being, took away all the atoms and separated all the atoms, and then put the atoms back together again in exactly the same arrangement, would that be the same person, or would it be a different version? Who knows? Also, if you modified a human being, if you replaced each one of their organs and replaced parts of their brain one by one, would that be the same person? Also, he cites an experiment, a quite feasible experiment that could be done, where you'd have 2 men and you swap their brains. So you give one person the other person's brain and vice versa, and then if one of those men went on to have a baby or get a woman pregnant, whose baby would that be? Because would it be the man's who owned the brain or the man who owned the body? It's another interesting one, and it discusses who a person is and what is the issue of self. He then goes on to make some predictions about the future. Some of these are quite unrealistic in my opinion. They're a bit too, they kind of remind me of the Jetsons in some way, but some of them are also quite clever. He envisions that in the future, if a widespread freezer program becomes the norm, it might be commonplace for people to receive prison sentences of about 1,000 years. Now in America, you already get this in a way. If you get arrested for kind of like multiple murder or something in America, you can actually get a prison sentence of about 200 years. But of course, nobody can serve that because we don't live long enough. But in the future, if there's some kind of tyrant or dictator who causes 1,000 people to starve, for example, a court might sentence that man to 1,000 years in prison, and he will actually serve it. Imagine that, 1,000 years in prison. He predicts more cameras, which has become a reality. He predicts weather control, which could become a reality. He envisions a time when people might be able to vote for a political party via their TV set, which could happen. He envisions intercontinental subway systems where you can go from one continent to another in minutes. And he also predicts a kind of universal income where each citizen might be paid money just for breathing and just for being alive. Sounds a bit utopian, but who knows, it could happen. And he also ends by claiming that a widespread freezer program could make everyone behave better towards each other. And the reason he gives for this is that if everybody lives for hundreds of years or thousands of years, you won't really want to upset people, because it won't be like today. If you upset somebody or have a fight with them or something, you might not see them again. But if people are living for thousands of years or hundreds of years, if you upset somebody, you'll almost certainly see that person again. So he thinks that the world might become more harmonious and more kind because of cryonics. And that basically sums up the book. There's a lot more stuff in there, obviously, so I recommend that you go out and read the book, because it is good. It was written all the way back in the 1960s, and it was way ahead of its time. I certainly enjoyed reading the book. So if you're into cryonics, or if you're interested in cryonics, definitely give it a read. On a personal note, I've always known about cryonics because it's in a lot of sci-fi films and stuff like that. But I started looking into this thing back in 2015, and I've actually become a member. I'm a member of the Cryonics Institute in Michigan, which is, I think, is the first cryonics company to exist, and it was the one that Robert Ettinger actually founded. And I've signed all the paperwork, and I'm a member. I've taken out the life insurance to pay for it all. So, you know, I'm all for it. But at the same time, I am quite sceptical. I have my doubts whether it could work or not. I'm under no illusions. You know, it might just be wishful thinking, but logically it certainly holds up. I think that medical technology progresses year by year, so in 100 years or 200 years, who knows, if you've been preserved well enough, you might be able to get revived and enjoy life all over again. And here's the point: a lot of people think, hang on, what's the point? You're going to wake up old, you're going to be an old man. But they fail to realise that when you wake up, or if you wake up, you're going to be modified. You're going to be young again. You're going to have a new body, new energy, and you're going to feel like, or you could feel like, you're 18 years old again. So when people reach the end of their life, they're very old, they're very tired, and they think, bloody hell, I couldn't do it all over again. I'm too tired. But that's the whole point. If you get revived, you might be a new person again, and you might feel young again, like a teenager or something. You might be full of energy and full of zest all over again. So I've signed up for it. I might change my mind in the future. I might back out of it, but right now I'm all for it. So thanks for watching. That's been The Prospect of Immortality by Robert Ettinger. Now, I want to remind you that there's a free mystery gift for becoming a member of my site, jamesflynn.org. It's very easy. Just head over to jamesflynn.org, click on the members only page, and just create an account, which takes about 1 minute, honestly, and there's a free mystery gift for doing so. So please head over and become a member, and thanks for watching. Have a great day. I'm currently reading Sapiens by that Harari guy, Noah Harari, or whatever his name is. It's a big book, so it's probably going to take me about at least 2 or 3 weeks to read. So, but keep an eye out for that one. Okay, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Goodbye. See you again.